Arrogant bikers laugh at a teen on the road. Seconds later, they're running for cover. The roar of engines echoed through the streets as Damon Knox Riker led his biker gang on another reckless ride. The crew, known for their daring stunts and intimidating presence, dominated the highway, leaving fear in their wake. Knox, a tall, muscular man with a scar running down his left cheek, reveled in the power he held over the road. His piercing blue eyes scanned the horizon, searching for anyone who dared to challenge his authority. As they sped through the city, the gang spotted a teenage boy riding a small motorcycle. Jake Calloway, unaware of the danger that loomed, focused on navigating the busy streets. Knox signaled to his crew, a wicked grin spreading across his face. They surrounded the young rider, their engines revving menacingly. Well, what do we have here?" Knox sneered, pulling up alongside Jake. "A little boy playing biker?" The gang members laughed, their mocking tones filling the air. They circled Jake, inching closer with each pass. One biker, a heavily tattooed man named Razor, swerved dangerously close to Jake, nearly forcing him off the road. Jake's heart raced as he tried to maintain control of his motorcycle. He knew he was outnumbered and outmatched, but he refused to show fear. His father, Alexander Calloway, had taught him to never back down from a challenge. Unbeknownst to the bikers, their actions had not gone unnoticed. In a nearby SUV, a man watched the scene unfold, his eyes narrowing. He reached for his phone and made a call, his voice low and urgent. As the bikers continued their taunts, Jake gripped the handlebars tightly, his knuckles turning white. He knew he had to stay calm and find a way out of this dangerous situation. Little did he realize that help was already on the way, and the bikers were about to face the consequences of their actions. Jake Calloway had grown up in the shadow of his father's criminal empire. Alexander Calloway, known as the Boss, controlled the city's underground racing scene and high-speed operations with an iron fist. Despite his father's reputation, Jake had always been determined to forge his own path. He loved the freedom and exhilaration of riding his motorcycle, but he had no interest in the illegal activities that consumed his father's life. As the bikers circled him, Jake's mind raced with possibilities. He knew he couldn't outrun them, but he refused to be intimidated. He had faced challenges before, both on and off the road, and he was determined to overcome this one as well. Meanwhile, the man in the SUV had set a plan in motion. He was Michael Stone, Alexander Calloway's right-hand man and head of security. Michael had been tasked with keeping an eye on Jake, ensuring his safety at all times. When he witnessed the biker's aggressive behavior, he knew he had to act fast. Michael spoke into his phone, his voice calm but urgent. "We have a situation. Jake is being targeted by a biker gang. Send reinforcements immediately." Within moments, a fleet of blacked-out SUVs and high-performance motorcycles appeared on the horizon, speeding towards the scene. The bikers, still caught up in their taunts, failed to notice the approaching danger. As the reinforcements drew closer, Jake saw his opportunity. He revved his engine and swerved sharply, breaking free from the circle of bikers. The sudden movement caught Knox off guard, and he cursed under his breath. "Get him!" Knox shouted to his gang, his eyes blazing with anger. The bikers sped after Jake, their engines roaring. But as they pursued him, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by Calloway's security team. The blacked-out vehicles boxed them in, forcing them to slow down. Jake, his heart pounding, glanced over his shoulder and saw the chaos unfolding behind him. He knew he had to keep riding, to put as much distance between himself and the bikers as possible. With a deep breath, he opened the throttle and sped away, leaving the sounds of screeching tires and shouting voices behind him. Damon Knox Riker was not used to being challenged. As the leader of the biker gang, he had built a reputation based on fear and intimidation. He had never encountered anyone who dared to defy him, let alone a teenage boy on a small motorcycle. As the security teams surrounded them, Knox realized the gravity of his mistake. He had underestimated the boy, and now he was facing the consequences. The blacked-out SUVs and high-performance motorcycles bore the unmistakable mark of Alexander Calloway's organization, and Knox knew he had picked a fight with the wrong person. "Stand down," Michael Stone's voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Knox's mind raced as he weighed his options. He could try to fight his way out, but he knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. His gang, once so confident and fearless, now looked to him for guidance, their eyes filled with uncertainty. In that moment, Knox made a decision. He raised his hands slowly, signaling his surrender. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his voice strained. "We didn't know the kid was with Calloway." Michael stepped out of the SUV, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "Ignorance is no excuse," he said, his tone sharp. "You made a mistake, and now you'll face the consequences." As the security team moved in, Knox and his gang were forced to dismount their bikes. They were searched and disarmed, their weapons confiscated. Knox watched helplessly as his crew was lined up against a wall, their hands behind their heads. Jake, having put some distance between himself and the bikers, finally slowed down. He pulled over to the side of the road, his heart still racing. He knew he had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As he sat on his motorcycle, trying to catch his breath, Jake's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his father. "Come home now. We need to talk." Jake sighed, knowing that he couldn't avoid the inevitable. With a heavy heart, he started his motorcycle and headed towards his father's estate, unsure of what the future held but determined to face it head-on. Jake arrived at his father's estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. As he parked his motorcycle, he noticed the increased security presence around the property. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their eyes watchful and alert. Jake made his way inside, his footsteps echoing in the grand foyer. He found his father, Alexander Calloway, waiting for him in the study. The room was dimly lit, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large mahogany desk dominating the space. Alexander looked up as Jake entered, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a leather chair in front of the desk. Jake obeyed, his nerves on edge. He had always had a complicated relationship with his father, a man who wielded power and control with a ruthless efficiency. "I heard about what happened today," Alexander began, his voice low and measured. "You were attacked by a biker gang." Jake nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't know what to do," he admitted. "They surrounded me, and I couldn't get away." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying his son. "You did the right thing by not engaging them," he said. "But you need to understand the gravity of the situation. Those bikers, they're not just some random thugs. They're part of a larger organization, one that has been causing trouble in the city." Jake's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Alexander sighed, rubbing his forehead. "There's a power struggle happening right now," he explained. "Different factions are vying for control of the underground racing scene. Those bikers, they're just pawns in a much bigger game." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had always known that his father was involved in dangerous activities, but he had never been directly exposed to them. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I need you to be careful, Jake," he said. "The world I operate in, it's not a place for the innocent. You need to be prepared for anything." Jake nodded, his mind reeling with the implications of his father's words. He knew that his life was about to change, and he had no idea what the future held. But one thing was certain, he would have to be strong and resilient if he wanted to survive in this new reality. In the days that followed, Jake found himself thrust into a world he had only ever glimpsed from the sidelines. His father, determined to keep him safe, assigned Michael Stone as his personal bodyguard. Jake chafed at the constant surveillance, feeling like a prisoner in his own life. Meanwhile, the power struggle in the city's underground racing scene intensified. Rival factions, each with their own ambitions and agendas, clashed in a series of high-stakes races and violent confrontations. The streets became a battleground, with innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Jake watched from afar, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his father was at the center of it all. He had always known that Alexander Calloway was a powerful man, but he had never fully grasped the extent of his influence and the darkness that surrounded him. As the days turned into weeks, Jake found himself drawn into the conflict. Despite his best efforts to stay out of it, he couldn't ignore the suffering and chaos that had engulfed the city. He saw families torn apart, businesses destroyed, and lives lost, all in the name of power and control. One evening, as he sat in his room, staring out the window at the city lights, Jake made a decision. He couldn't stand by and watch as his father's world tore itself apart. He had to do something, to find a way to bring peace and stability back to the streets. With a determined set to his jaw, Jake began to plan. He knew he couldn't take on the rival factions alone, but he also knew that he had resources and connections that could make a difference. He reached out to old friends, former classmates, and anyone else who might be willing to help. Slowly but surely, a new faction began to take shape, one that was dedicated to ending the violence and restoring order to the city. Jake knew that the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had found his purpose, and he would stop at nothing to see it through. As Jake's new faction grew in strength and numbers, they began to make their presence known on the streets. They started small, intervening in minor disputes and providing aid to those caught in the crossfire. But as their reputation spread, they found themselves drawn into larger conflicts, facing off against the rival factions that had long dominated the city. One of their first major tests came when they received word of a high-stakes race being organized by one of the most notorious factions in the city. The race, which was to take place on a treacherous mountain road outside the city limits, was rumored to be a cover for a major drug deal. Jake knew that they had to act fast. If the deal went through, it would only strengthen the faction's grip on the city. He gathered his team and set out to intercept the racers before they could reach their destination. The race was already underway by the time they arrived, with dozens of high-performance cars and motorcycles tearing through the winding mountain roads. Jake and his team split up, each taking a different route to try and cut off the racers. As Jake rounded a sharp bend, he saw a familiar figure up ahead. It was Knox, the leader of the biker gang that had attacked him weeks earlier. Knox was riding a sleek black motorcycle, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Jake gunned his engine and sped up, determined to catch up to Knox. But as he drew closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Knox had a gun in his hand, and he was aiming it at one of the other racers. Without hesitation, Jake swerved his motorcycle into Knox's path, forcing him to veer off the road. The two bikes collided in a shower of sparks and metal, sending both riders tumbling to the ground. As Jake struggled to his feet, he saw Knox lying motionless a few feet away. He had no idea if the biker was alive or dead, but he knew that he had to keep moving. The race was still ongoing, and there was too much at stake to stop now. With Knox out of the picture, Jake and his team redoubled their efforts to stop the drug deal. They managed to intercept the racers just before they reached the rendezvous point, forcing them to abandon their vehicles and flee on foot into the surrounding woods. As the sun began to set, Jake and his team combed the area, searching for any sign of the dealers or their product. They had almost given up hope when they stumbled upon a hidden cabin deep in the woods. Inside, they found a scene of chaos and confusion. The dealers, caught off guard by the sudden interruption, had abandoned their merchandise and fled into the night. Bags of drugs and stacks of cash littered the floor, along with a scattering of weapons and ammunition. Jake knew that they had struck a major blow against the faction, but he also knew that the fight was far from over. The other factions would be quick to take advantage of the power vacuum, and the streets would soon be plunged back into chaos. As they made their way back to the city, Jake's mind was racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He knew that he had to keep pushing forward, to build on the momentum they had gained and find a way to bring lasting peace to the city. But he also knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty. The factions would not give up their power easily, and there would be many more battles to come before the city could truly be free. As they drove through the night, Jake found himself thinking of his father, and the role he had played in all of this. He knew that Alexander Calloway was a complicated man, with his own demons and his own agenda. But he also knew that, in his own way, his father had been trying to protect him, to keep him safe from the dangers of the world he inhabited. With a heavy heart, Jake resolved to keep fighting, to honor his father's legacy and build a better future for the city he called home. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them head-on, with courage and determination. In the weeks that followed, Jake and his team worked tirelessly to consolidate their gains and build alliances with other groups who shared their vision for a better future. They reached out to community leaders, business owners, and anyone else who had a stake in seeing the city thrive. At first, progress was slow. Many people were wary of getting involved, fearful of the repercussions that might come from standing up to the established factions. But as word of Jake's efforts spread, more and more people began to rally to his cause. One of the most significant turning points came when they managed to broker a truce between two rival factions that had been locked in a bitter feud for years. The leaders of both groups, impressed by Jake's diplomacy and determination, agreed to put aside their differences and work together for the greater good. With this new alliance in place, Jake and his team were able to make even greater strides. They organized community events, sponsored job training programs, and worked to build a sense of unity and purpose among the people of the city. But even as they made progress, Jake knew that the danger was never far away. The remaining factions, threatened by the growing power of his movement, began to lash out with increasing violence and desperation. One night, as Jake was leaving a community meeting, he was ambushed by a group of heavily armed men. They surrounded him, their weapons trained on his chest, and demanded that he surrender. But Jake, emboldened by the support of his team and the knowledge that he was fighting for something greater than himself, refused to back down. With lightning-fast reflexes, he disarmed the nearest attacker and used him as a human shield, forcing the others to hold their fire. In the chaos that followed, Jake managed to escape, but not before taking a bullet to the shoulder. As he stumbled through the darkened streets, bleeding and in pain, he knew that the fight was far from over. But he also knew that he would never give up, no matter what the cost. As Jake recovered from his injury, he began to realize that the battle for the city's future was entering a new phase. The remaining factions, desperate to maintain their grip on power, were becoming increasingly ruthless and unpredictable. One of the most dangerous developments came when a new player entered the scene, a mysterious figure known only as the Shadow. Little was known about this individual, but rumors swirled that he had ties to powerful criminal organizations in other cities and was determined to take control of the underworld by any means necessary. At first, Jake and his team tried to reach out to the Shadow, hoping to find a way to work together for the greater good. But it soon became clear that the Shadow had no interest in compromise or cooperation. He saw Jake and his movement as a threat to his power and was determined to crush them at any cost. As the weeks passed, the city descended into a state of all-out war. The Shadow's forces, heavily armed and well-funded, launched a series of devastating attacks on Jake's allies, targeting community centers, businesses, and anyone else who dared to stand in their way. Jake and his team fought back with everything they had, but they were outmatched and outgunned. They suffered heavy losses, with many of their bravest and most committed members falling in battle. But even in the darkest of times, Jake refused to give up hope. He knew that the people of the city were counting on him, and he was determined to keep fighting, no matter what the cost. One night, as he lay in a makeshift hospital bed, recovering from his latest injuries, Jake received a visit from an unexpected ally. It was his father, Alexander Calloway, looking older and more weary than Jake had ever seen him. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at each other, unsure of what to say. But then, Alexander spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'm proud of you, son," he said. "You're fighting for something bigger than yourself, something that matters. And I want you to know that I'm with you, no matter what happens." Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes as he reached out to take his father's hand. For the first time in his life, he felt truly connected to the man who had raised him, and he knew that, together, they would find a way to build a better future for the city they both loved. With his father's support, Jake found new strength and determination to keep fighting. He and his team redoubled their efforts, focusing on building alliances and gathering intelligence on the Shadow's operations. They soon discovered that the Shadow was planning a massive shipment of weapons and drugs, one that would give him an unassailable advantage in the battle for control of the city. Jake knew that they had to stop the shipment at any cost, or risk losing everything they had fought so hard to achieve. Working together with his father and a network of trusted allies, Jake put together a daring plan to intercept the shipment before it could reach its destination. They would have to move quickly and strike hard, using every resource at their disposal. On the night of the operation, Jake and his team moved into position, their hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. They knew that they were risking everything, but they also knew that the stakes could not be higher. As the convoy carrying the shipment made its way through the darkened streets, Jake gave the signal to attack. His team sprang into action, using a combination of speed, stealth, and brute force to overwhelm the guards and seize control of the vehicles. The battle was fierce and bloody, with casualties on both sides. But in the end, Jake and his team emerged victorious, having captured the entire shipment and dealt a devastating blow to the Shadow's power. As the sun began to rise over the city, Jake stood amidst the wreckage of the battle, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He knew that the fight was far from over, but he also knew that they had taken a crucial step forward. With renewed determination, he turned to his team and his father, ready to continue the struggle for as long as it took. They had come too far to turn back now, and they would not rest until the city was free from the grip of violence and corruption that had held it captive for so long. In the aftermath of the successful operation against the Shadow, Jake and his team knew that they had to press their advantage. They had dealt a significant blow to their enemy's power, but they also knew that he would not go down without a fight. As they worked to consolidate their gains and build on their momentum, Jake received an unexpected message from the Shadow himself. The message was brief and cryptic, but its meaning was clear. The Shadow wanted to meet, to discuss terms of surrender. Jake was wary of the invitation, knowing that it could be a trap. But he also knew that they might never have another chance to end the conflict once and for all. After much deliberation, he agreed to the meeting, but only on his own terms. The meeting took place in a neutral location, with both sides agreeing to come unarmed and alone. As Jake arrived at the designated spot, he saw the Shadow emerge from the shadows, his face obscured by a dark hood. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at each other, sizing each other up. Then, the Shadow spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You've put up a good fight, kid," he said. "But you know you can't win. Why don't you just give up now, before anyone else gets hurt?" Jake felt a surge of anger at the man's words, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I'm not giving up," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to offer you a chance to surrender, to end this conflict before it destroys everything we both care about." The Shadow laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think I care about this city?" he asked. "I care about power, about control. And I'll do whatever it takes to get it." With those words, the Shadow reached into his cloak and pulled out a hidden weapon. But before he could use it, Jake was on him, his own hidden blade flashing in the dim light. The two men struggled for a moment, but in the end, it was Jake who emerged victorious, his blade buried deep in the Shadow's chest. As he watched the life fade from his enemy's eyes, Jake felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. There was still much work to be done, to heal the wounds of the past and build a better future for the city he loved. With the Shadow defeated, Jake and his team knew that they had to move quickly to fill the power vacuum left behind. They reached out to the remaining factions, offering them a chance to join forces and work together for the greater good. To their surprise, many of the factions were receptive to the idea. They had grown weary of the constant fighting and bloodshed, and they saw in Jake a leader who could bring stability and prosperity to the city. One by one, the factions came together, laying down their weapons and pledging their support to Jake's cause. They worked together to rebuild what had been destroyed, to create new opportunities for those who had been left behind. As the city began to heal, Jake knew that he had to lead by example. He worked tirelessly to bring people together, to bridge the divides that had torn them apart for so long. He organized community events, sponsored job training programs, and worked to create a sense of shared purpose and identity among the people of the city. And slowly but surely, the city began to change. The streets that had once been filled with violence and despair now buzzed with energy and hope. People who had once been enemies now worked side by side, united in their desire to build a better future. One day, as Jake walked through the streets of the city he had fought so hard to save, he came across a familiar face. It was Knox, the leader of the biker gang that had once been his enemy. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, unsure of what to say. But then, Knox spoke, his voice gruff but sincere. "I was wrong about you, kid," he said. "You've done more for this city than I ever could have imagined. I'm sorry for what I did, and I want to help in any way I can." Jake felt a lump in his throat as he reached out to shake Knox's hand. He knew that there was still much work to be done, but he also knew that, together, they could build a city that was stronger, safer, and more just than ever before. As the months passed, Jake and his team continued to work tirelessly to build on the progress they had made. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were determined to see it through to the end. One of the biggest challenges they faced was finding ways to address the underlying issues that had led to the conflict in the first place. They knew that simply defeating their enemies was not enough. They had to create a new system that was more equitable and just for everyone. To that end, they worked to create new programs and initiatives that would provide opportunities for those who had been left behind. They invested in education and job training, and they worked to create a more transparent and accountable government that would serve the needs of all its citizens. As they worked, Jake began to realize that the true strength of his movement lay not in his own leadership, but in the collective power of the people he had brought together. He saw how each person, no matter their background or experience, had something valuable to contribute to the cause. One day, as he stood before a crowd of supporters, Jake felt a sense of overwhelming gratitude and pride. He knew that he had not done this alone, that he had been carried forward by the courage and determination of countless others. "My friends," he said, his voice ringing out across the gathering. "We have come so far together, and we have achieved so much. But our work is not yet done. We must continue to fight, to strive, to build a better world for ourselves and for generations to come." As he spoke, Jake felt a sense of hope and possibility that he had never known before. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that, together, they could overcome any obstacle. And so, with renewed determination and a sense of purpose that burned brighter than ever before, Jake and his team set out to continue their work, to build a city that was truly worthy of its people, and to create a legacy that would endure for generations to come. Years later, as Jake looked back on all that had happened, he knew that the journey had been worth it. The city that had once been torn apart by violence and despair was now a thriving metropolis, a beacon of hope and possibility for all who lived there. He thought back to the early days of his movement, when he had been just a teenage boy on a small motorcycle, facing down a gang of ruthless bikers. He remembered the fear and uncertainty he had felt, the sense that he was in over his head. But he also remembered the moment when everything had changed, when he had realized that he was not alone, that there were others who shared his vision for a better world. He remembered the friendships he had forged, the sacrifices that had been made, and the triumphs that had been won. As he walked through the streets of the city he had helped to build, Jake felt a sense of deep satisfaction and pride. He saw the community centers and schools that had been built, the businesses that had been started, and the lives that had been transformed. And he knew that none of it would have been possible without the courage and determination of the people who had stood beside him, who had believed in the power of unity and hope. As he looked to the future, Jake knew that there would be new challenges to face, new obstacles to overcome. But he also knew that, together, they could face anything that came their way. And so, with a smile on his face and a song in his heart, Jake stepped forward into the bright new dawn, ready to continue the work that he had begun so many years ago, and to build a world that was truly worthy of the hopes and dreams of all who lived in it.